this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget.
Today I'm having a conversation with Sherry Turkle. Sherry is the Abby Rockefeller Mosaic Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT and the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self. A licensed clinical psychologist, she is the author of 6 books, including Alone Together and the New York Times bestseller Reclaiming Conversation. A Ms. Magazine Woman of the Year, a TED speaker, and featured media commentator, Sherry is a recipient of Guggenheim and Rockefeller Humanities Fellowships and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Sherry, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure.
So I feel like I should address the elephant in the room before we even begin. I'm an electrical engineer from Georgia Tech whose focus happens to be on people and the importance of face-to-face conversation. And based on what I've read in your books, I think I'm an anomaly compared to what you've dealt with in your career, so please don't hold my degree against me. One of the things I like to start with is that there's a word that runs through a book, and in your case, a couple of them. I'd like the author to define it. In this case, the word is empathy. How do you define empathy?
Well, I define empathy a little bit more robustly than some other people. For me, empathy is a process of engagement where you make a commitment to somebody else to not say, I think I know what you're thinking, but rather to say, I don't know what you're thinking, but I'm here and I make a commitment to really try to understand what's on your mind and how you got there and what do you want to do about it next. And that commitment involves kind of making a space where we can talk about it and you can learn about me as well and we can really have a conversation. And I'm also going to accompany you to the implications of some of your ideas and what they'll mean for me so we can have a true connection. And I think in our country now, we're so divided and a lot of people are just saying, oh, empathy is the answer. Everybody wants empathy. I mean, in some of the political conventions, I mean, every last word was that we should just call for empathy. But people seem to be meaning something much less by it. And I really think that we need to focus on empathy as a very hard thing, not an easy thing. And I'm trying to make political engagement include this kind of empathy, where you're really in it for the duration. So I don't know if that was a simple answer to a straightforward question, but it's empathy is a commitment to be a kind of listener and a kind of being there for the long haul for somebody.
Well, I've always felt semantics matters, and so how I define a word may be different than you. And since I wanted to understand what your definition of it was, I even wrote down that somewhere in one of the texts you said empathy means staying in the conversation long enough for someone to believe that you want to know how they feel, not that you want to tell them what you would do in their circumstances. And when you said that, I was right back into the early days of my marriage when my wife would be telling me something about that was bothering her. And my immediate inclination, of course, was to tell her how to fix it. In my mind, I was being very helpful, but she quickly informed me my job was to listen and not tell her what to do.
Right. Well, I think that is often the next step in what happens when people feel they're being empathic, is they feel they've been down that road before. I've been divorced. So when somebody starts to tell me about a marriage that's starting to go bad, for example, your first impulse is, well, of course I'm not telling you what to do, but here's what I did was help Israeli. And you really have to stop that and just stay with and learn about the person who's talking. And you'll hear, because really the human desire to be heard and understood is really what we're missing. That's what people feel that they don't have in this world.
Well, I know that as an engineer myself, I certainly am guilty of it, and that's wanting to solve problems, right? So you want to just cut to the chase, solve the problem, move to the next problem.
Yes.
And sometimes that's not, oftentimes that's not what's being asked of us. It's we're being asked to listen and try to understand. Now, empathy or lack thereof was a major theme in your last book, Reclaiming Conversation, and it's in the title of your newest book, The Empathy Diaries. Why is empathy so important to you?
Well, it's interesting. I see these works, I see myself as writing a kind of trilogy in which, well, first of all, empathy is important because it's in solitude that empathy is born. It's in vulnerability that empathy is born. And really, so much of my work is involved in the way in which solitude and vulnerability need to be brought back into our life, capacities that our technology takes away from us. So I should just say that my framing of empathy is to say that if you want it, you have to step back and say, how can I do the hard work of bringing back the conditions for having it? So, in preface to answering your questions, I'll say how I got to this book about writing empathy, because I feel as though I've been kind of on a path towards getting there, which was I wrote a book called Alone Together. And there I saw a problem that to achieve empathy, we need to connect, and the technology isolates us. Not because it wants to, not because technology said, I know what we should do, we should create a technology to isolate people, but it does. It does because it puts us in situations that flatten our discourse and it makes us do more than one thing at a time, because the technology is so seductive. It takes us away from the kind of focus, for example, the kind of focus I have on you now, that where I'm really can connect with what you're asking and what you're feeling and what you're communicating. And then in reclaiming conversation, this is an example, something's ringing in my house. I've turned everything off, and it's my house is so filled with stuff that the fact that I've turned off my phone, I've turned off my iPad, but it's like there is something that is ringing in my environment, and that's the kind of thing that is not good for,
right.
for connection.
Right.
And particularly that I don't know what it is. Since my
so part of your brain is thinking, what is that? And
exactly. My phone is off, my computer is. This is the only app running. My iPad is off. Theoretically, nothing is home except me. But that's how technology is. It has kind of, there's some underlying something that's not deactivated.
It is ubiquitous.
We'll just continue. In reclaiming conversation, I tell about one solution. It's to be in person and in conversation, but you can't do that until you know yourself. You need to talk to yourself and have the capacity for solitude. For the reason that I said, because it's only in solitude, when you know yourself, that you can turn to another person and not try to let them tell you who you are, because you know who you are. You have the capacity for solitude, but you can really listen to what they have to say. So that's the trouble with empathy and technology, is that you need solitude, the capacity for solitude, to be able to cultivate empathy, and technology can take that away from us. And then as Empathy Diaries, I said, I've got to do this for my own case. I've got to do the practical application for my life and show that it takes work. This was so important to me because I didn't have empathy as a child. I had to learn how to develop it as a kind of survival mechanism, but how much work it took. And that it's not just something where you say, oh, I'm just going to listen very carefully to what Who's He What's has to say. And that as it becomes more important in the life of our country politically now, and certainly in the life of us all personally, as we try to help each other coming out of the pandemic, we should anticipate that it's going to be difficult, and it's going to take being very kind to each other and very patient with each other and very, very tolerant. And it's going to take a lot of time.
Now, one of the words you used was solitude, and you make a point several times in the book to make sure people understand solitude does not equal loneliness.
No.
So can you touch on that?
Solitude is the capacity And, you teach children solitude by taking walks with them and holding their hand. And gradually, that feeling of just being able to enjoy nature and getting into your headspace, it becomes associated with the calming effect of having a person who cares about you there with you. And solitude can be reading a book. Solitude can be watching a movie, and it can be reading a poem. It can be a reverie. It's a time when you gather yourself. I mean, it's not for me to say how you gather yourself, but everybody knows how they gather themselves and how they find themselves taking a drive. I mean, everybody knows how they find themselves. And Thoreau, who I come back to so much in my writing, there's a very famous saying that Thoreau built his getaway cabin within distance of Emerson's dinner bell, because his idea of solitude was having dinner with the Emersons at night. That was because he wanted a good conversation. Then he wanted to go back to the cabin and read and get a good night's sleep and take a morning walk. But for Thoreau, what solitude was acting deliberately and not being thick with people. And by that he meant that he didn't want to be constantly bumping into people and having relationships with them that were trivial, that were forced, that weren't really meaningful to him. And I think that has been sort of where I think that my work now, and this book in particular, is so relevant to the pandemic, because we've had all this time alone, and now we come out and we want the full embrace of the human. But we also know that we need to be deliberate in our use of technology, and we're going to be encouraged to use a lot of technology as we come out of the pandemic, because companies and educational systems and places we work are going to say, oh my God, you used it so well during the pandemic. What about if we keep teaching this way? What about if you keep working that way? We made so much money. You did your job so well, And we have to be very deliberate, like Thoreau, and say, well, maybe you made so much money, but that work was a very lonely and alienating experience for me. So not so fast. Let's ask how to best use technology as we come out of this, not just.
Yeah, we're definitely going to touch on that topic a little bit later on.
Yeah, sure.
Two things come to mind in this. One is I didn't enjoy Thoreau as a 16-year-old, but maybe I need to revisit it because you do talk about him a lot. And I remember, I didn't write this down, so this is from memory, but I think you talked about the virtuous circle, and there's 3 chairs in the circle, and one involves others and one involves society.
Yeah.
I think that's what you were just talking about. And the other thing I've heard you say, either on your TED Talk or I read it, was if we don't teach children how to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely.
Yes. That the capacity to be alone, to feel okay in your skin, is what makes people good to be with others. Because the kind of person who's like really isn't okay with their own skin, and who's always kind of like with you to sort of go, what should I do? What should I think? What should I this? What should we hate those people. We don't want to be with those people. We want to be with people who know what they're about, because we feel that nurtures us. We don't want to be with the people who seem to just want to be there so they can let us tell them what to think. So that's a very famous line from the psychoanalytic canon. Teach your children to be alone, or they'll only know how to be lonely. But it goes for grown-ups too. Teach yourself how to be alone, or you will be lonely. You won't have the right capacities to really be in a dialogue with other people and be in an empathic dialogue with other people.
And you say that technology ends up being one of the things that facilitates that, is this desire to not be bored. And people are constantly, rather than being in some solitude and thinking about things in quiet, they immediately grab whatever the technology is, the TV, the cell phone, the smartphone, whatever, the laptop, the tablet, just because they want to do something different and not be bored at all.
Yes, the capacity for boredom is one of the most important human capacities. And it turns out that neurologically, and this is something that I had to learn because I'm not a neurologist, that neurologically, when we're bored, that feeling of boredom that you get, your brain is not bored. Your brain is doing this incredibly important work, and it's laying down the kinds of neurons that will be important for your autobiographical sense of continuity of self. And wow, all those those hours in the taxi, or those half hours in the taxi when you're just looking out the window and your mind is going to this and that, your brain is busy. So we pay a cost if we're never bored. We never allow ourselves that feeling. And so when I first heard about these baby bouncers with a slot for an iPad and these potty trainers with a slot for an iPad, I hit the ceiling. I went so crazy.
Yeah, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, you attended Radcliffe for your undergrad, but took a break between your junior and senior year to spend some time in Paris. You write a lot about May 1968. What was really happening at that time? Because it seemed to have a huge impact on your focus.
Yes. Well, May 1968, it started with a strike at the University of Nanterre, really over, student stuff. The French university system was very sclerotic. It was really not a great university system. And then because of other things that really underlay the French social life at the time, it burst out into a very general protest at every level of French society. Workers, students, shockingly found common cause. And really, for a couple of months there, French society kind of stopped. And I was studying at the time an anthropologist, Victor Turner, who wrote about times like that, called liminal moments, where old things break down and new things haven't started up again. The old rules don't work and new rules haven't been written, which is really what May was about. It turned out not to be as much of a political revolution as it seemed. De Gaulle was in power before, de Gaulle came back to power after. And I was so struck by it because it comes back to me now as something that I think our country is going through. So many things we thought were true of this country, a lot of people are saying, no, that wasn't true of this country. Before Texas had its current problems with the storm and the grid and so forth, I watched in horror a news program that showed a stadium full of cars of Texans who had never been on a food line before.
Right.
Just waiting in their cars in this stadium for a week's worth of food. Most of it was kind of carbohydrates. There were a couple of canned vegetables and a little bit of protein. I mean, to try to feed maybe a family of 5 by stretching that out. And these cars were like really beautiful cars.
Right.
I mean, and the Black Lives Matter and the ways in which these police departments were treating Black young men who were jogging. So these are things that, did I know but could not say? Did I know but didn't want to fully acknowledge? The amount of voter suppression, I think I knew. But since Barack Obama had gotten elected twice anyway, I didn't sort of need to confront. I'm speaking personally. I mean,
Right.
I think I've been going through, and I can see so many people going through, a kind of coming to terms with the ways in which my pieties, our pieties, because I think I have similar pieties to other people, things are breaking down and we're confronting new things anew. In my book, I call it dépaysement, decountrifying, being asked to stand aside from what you know and see it with fresh eyes, which was my experience when I went to France and then came back to this country and saw it anew and saw my life from a different point of view.
Right.
And so that was the effect it had on me. Also in France, because I worked as a cleaning lady, my employers called me the Portugaise because they're Portuguese. Really, I'm a Jewish girl from Brooklyn who had gotten into Harvard. I mean, very little in common with Portuguese. I didn't speak Portuguese, but what they meant was to say I was a Portuguese was to say I was a cleaning lady. Right. And that experience of being put in a category of cleaning lady, where that we're using the phrase the Portuguese was the way to categorize me in a way that meant I could be invisible was also something new for me, also part of my French lessons that made me see my life anew. And I think that all of those things made the May Days, the recognition of a liminal state, a time betwixt and between, what could happen in such moments, bringing that back to America and using it to think about the 60s and now the women's movement, and now using it to think about what's happening now, the experience of being a category, not a person. All of these things were very important to me.
Well, speaking of the Portuguese comment, I was going to ask you about that because, first of all, side note, I now know how to clean my windows without Windex. It's, hint to the listeners, it's vinegar and newspapers.
Yeah.
But I also was wondering, what impact is being labeled and only viewed through that lens have on both parties, the labeled and the labeler?
It's devastating. It's devastating. Now, it was devastating on me, but I recognized it because I'm a Jew, but I'm a Jew who never had the experience of being labeled as a Jew and only known as a Jew. But that was an experience of my very near ancestors during World War II. So, in other words, when I had that experience, I could say, well, this has never happened to me, but I was having an experience that was very close to me because the French had rounded up their Jews and sent them away to Drancy and then to Auschwitz, and all over Europe that had happened, and to members of my extended family that had happened. In other words, it wasn't an experience that I could say, well, I've never heard of anything like this before. So I was having an experience that was like, oh my God, this is what it feels like. In my case, the cost was very low, but being thingified was very resonant for me. And I think both the experience of being thingified and being given an etiquette instead of a name, and also the fact that I think I write in the book that if I lost that job, it would have been a catastrophe. Now, I would have gone to some kind of shelter. I would have, I don't know, I always think that people who are resourceful find resources. So in my case, that's been true. I think I would have found some kind of shelter. I would have gotten back on my feet.
Well, I think you would have, because I noticed that in the book, the place you were staying did not have a shower.
No.
And so once a week you went to visit another person that had one, and you could actually take a bath there. So I suspect you just would have refused to leave the bathroom. You had your place to stay.
I just sort of slept in the bathtub. But I guess what I'm saying is that I had the feeling for the first time in my life that I needed that job. I could not lose that job. And I think that having that feeling has stood me in very good stead through the rest of my life, because I feel that in terms of empathy, I know what that feeling looks like. It doesn't take a lot for me to put myself emotionally in that position of, right, I need that job. I'm here alone in this strange country. I need this job.
I'm a big fan of conversation. When I'm preaching about the superiority of face-to-face conversations over text-based communication, someone will often take the extreme position that I'm saying never use anything but face-to-face conversation. And I love how you say it in Reclaiming Conversation, and I'm quoting here, sometimes face-to-face conversation is not the right tool for a particular job, but having the whole person before you is reliably the best way to begin.
Yeah. And then it sometimes turns out that for some people, a telephone conversation is relaxing. Just using the voice, not having to worry how they look. I think the main thing is the person feel that you have their full attention. I think the issue really is attention. What's hurtful about Zoom, what's hard about Zoom, is that you can't look at the person in the eye. And so to give the impression that you're looking, I've written extensively about this actually, to give the impression that you're looking at someone in the eye, you have to look at the little green light on your computer.
Right.
But if you're looking, so in order to give the impression, if we were on Zoom, that I was looking at you in the eye, I would have to be looking at nothing and sort of acting into the green light, imagining what it might be like looking at you in the eye.
And ironically, if I wanted to reciprocate, I would be looking at the green light and neither one of us would see each other.
Right, exactly. But to give the impression, right, of attention, both of us are looking at nothing. Now, on the empathy, on the empathyometer, in terms of will that conversation enhance our empathic on an emotional level? I mean, not in terms of kilowatts of kilobytes of energy, of information passed. Will you tell me about your mother? Will I tell you about my father? I bet you tell me a lot about your mother. I could tell you stuff about my father. But in terms of relating to you, if really to get you to feel connected to me, I literally am faking the whole thing because I'm looking at a green light. I haven't seen you through the whole conversation. This empathy thing that I'm talking about, I'm telling you, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Because we're not, I mean, it's so the whole thing is like, the thing is not happening, this thing.
Actually, that actually segues really nicely in you kind of answered part of the question I was going to ask you, but you mentioned cognitive neuroscientist Atsushi Sunju in Reclaiming Conversations, and that is studies showed that the parts of the brain that allow us to process another person's feelings and intentions are activated by eye contact. And so I was going to mention that I guess science has confirmed the old saying that the eyes are the windows to the soul.
Yes, and it makes sense, but it also makes sense that it's not going to happen if the eye contact is like some kind of faux eye contact. Right. Because I really haven't made any contact. I'm just staring at this. I'm just trying to be like I'm trying to do it now. I'm trying to be like a super actress into this green light, because I know that you can feel more connected to me if I look at this green light. Well, that's how I teach. And after I teach like that, I love teaching. I really love teaching. And, I love my writing and my research and my interviewing, but I really love teaching. And usually I leave a class, I teach at MIT is on the Charles River, and I come out of class and I feel energized. I take a walk on the river and I sit on a bench, and I'm just feeling, how lucky am I that this is my job. I just get to be in a classroom with these people, and talk to them. And they talk to me. I mean, it's like, and when I teach on Zoom, and I have really tried to, I have tried to make myself into the best, truly. I don't have a passive aggressive bone in my body. I mean, I really, that is not I'm not a perfect person, but that is not my thing. And I really have tried to make myself like into the best Zoomer ever. And I finish these classes after pouring my every bit of energy into it, and I just feel depleted. I just feel depleted. You couldn't get me on a walk. You couldn't get me on a walk. I literally, because I'm at home, I just lie down on my bed. I have a very fluffy comforter. I take some Tylenol. I kind of get under it. I don't want to say I get into fetal position, because that makes me sound like really a little bit extreme. But I really am, but it wouldn't be too far off. I mean, I'm collecting myself.
Right.
I've been staring at this green dot because I want people to think I'm looking at them.
Right.
And I every once in a while I take a furtive glance at the little faces, but this is not a good thing.
Well, that concludes part one of my conversation with Sherry Turkle, author of Reclaiming Conversation and the upcoming book, The Empathy Diaries. Coming up in part two, we'll discuss why multitasking is not a panacea, but actually a detriment to productivity.
There's no such thing as multitasking. The brain is able to do one thing at a time. And there are great studies that show that when you're multitasking, you're doing everything worse. So for every task you add, you're doing all your tasks worse. But you have the illusion, and this is what is so pernicious, that you're doing everything better. So it's like when you multitask, you take a drug that makes you think you're doing all the tasks better, when in fact you're doing every task worse.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton and Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at Amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.